The harsh, white light dimmed, then stabilized, pulling me from a slumber. Another day in Site 19. Another day as a lab rat. D-173-3. That's what they called me now. Stripped of my name, my past, my dignity. Just another disposable asset in the Foundation's pursuit of the unknown. I sat up, the rough fabric of the standard issue jumpsuit scratching against my skin. I scanned the confines of my cell. It was more like a repurposed storage closet. Bare concrete walls, a narrow cot, a stainless steel toilet in the corner. Rows of identical cells lined the corridor beyond the reinforced door, each housing another unfortunate soul caught in the Foundation's web. They used to tell us back in orientation that we were vital, that we were helping protect humanity. Bullshit. We were expendable and we knew it. It had been, 3 months since they took me. 3 months since my life as Anders Nielsen, respected, if somewhat controversial, art critic, imploded. One day I was examining brushstrokes. The next I was staring down the barrel of a conviction for embezzlement. A crime I'd been framed for, obviously. But try proving that when the evidence is stacked against you and your reputation is in tatters. Then the Foundation stepped in, offering a way out. A way out of prison, they said. A chance to serve humanity. Lies. All of it. There was no way out, not really. Only through. They presented it as a choice, but it wasn't. Comply or disappear. The memories of the first few weeks were the worst. The disorientation, the fear, the brutal efficiency of the intake process. They ran tests, poked, prodded, injected God knows what into me. Then came the orientation, a chillingly clinical presentation delivered by a man in a white coat, his voice devoid of any inflection. He spoke of anomalies, objects, and entities that defied the known laws of nature, things the Foundation studied and contained. He called them SCPs. He described our role, the role of D-class personnel in their containment with the same detachment one might use to describe cleaning supplies. The constant surveillance, the cameras in every corner watching, recording. It was a panopticon designed to break you, to make you compliant. My attention shifted towards a small scratch on the wall near the floor, a tiny imperfection in the otherwise flawless concrete. I'd noticed it a few weeks ago, a subtle deviation in the texture. It was these small details that kept me sane, the tiny anomalies in this meticulously controlled environment. My art critic's eye, trained to discern subtle nuances, found solace in these imperfections. I ran my fingers over the scratch, the subtle difference in texture noticeable against the otherwise uniform surface of the wall. It was a small act of defiance, a way of reclaiming some sense of agency in a place where autonomy was an illusion. The door to my cell opened, the sound cutting through the silence like a scalpel. 2 guards, clad in black tactical gear, stood in the doorway. Their presence was always unsettling. D-173-3, one of them barked, his voice distorted by the helmet's comm system. Cleaning duty. It was time. Time to face the statue again. SCP-173. The designation echoed in my mind, each syllable a hammer blow against the fragile walls of my composure. They had briefed us on it during orientation, a cold, factual recitation of its properties. Animate, hostile, constructed from concrete and rebar with traces of Krylon spray paint. The most chilling detail, it could only move when not directly observed. Break the line of sight even for a blink, and it would be on you, snapping your neck with impossible speed. Strangulation was also a possibility. We were marched down the corridors, the rhythmic thump of our boots against the concrete floor, the only sound besides the omnipresent beeping that followed us everywhere. The beeping was tied to the monitoring equipment. I knew it tracked our movements, our heart rates, probably even our brain waves. I tried to ignore the pressure sensors under my feet as we walked. They could sense if you stopped, if you hesitated. You couldn't hide anything in this place. I fell into step with the 2 other D-class assigned to the SCP-173. D-173-1, a hulking man named Big Ed Santini, convicted of multiple homicides, and D-173-2, a wiry, nervous man named Silver, a former accountant in for some kind of financial fraud. Santini, despite his intimidating presence, seemed just as terrified as the rest of us. Silver was a wreck, his hands constantly trembling, his eyes darting around nervously. We were all trapped in the same nightmare, bound by a shared sense of dread and the faint hope of survival. The training had been grueling, a never-ending repetition of the containment procedures. 3 personnel in the chamber at all times, 2 maintaining direct eye contact with the statue, the 3rd performing the cleaning. Verbal alerts before blinking. Blinking 1, blinking 2, a constant, monotonous litany designed to prevent any lapse in observation. We practiced in a mock containment chamber, the rhythmic beeping of the monitoring equipment a maddening presence. They drilled the Class 4 hazardous object containment procedures into us, the emergency protocols for a breach, lockdown, armed response teams, neutralization. The words were clinical, detached, but the implications were terrifying. We reached the containment chamber, a heavy steel door emblazoned with the SCP-173 designation and a series of warning symbols. 2 guards stood on either side, their rifles held at the ready. They never spoke, never made eye contact. They were just another part of the machine, a different set of guards than the ones who'd brought us down. I wondered if they rotated them to prevent any kind of familiarity, any chance of human connection. One of the guards swiped a card, and the door opened, revealing the dimly lit chamber within. The smell hit me first, a pungent, acrid odor that clung to the back of my throat, a mix of bleach and something foul and organic. The statue, SCP-173, stood in the center of the room, its grotesque humanoid form frozen in an unnatural pose. It was taller than I expected, its concrete surface stained with a reddish-brown substance that I knew from the briefing was a mixture of feces and blood. The origin of the stains was unknown, another unsettling detail in the long list of things we didn't understand about this place, or the things they kept here. The heavy door clanged shut behind us, the sound echoing in the confined space, sealing us in with the statue. The 3 of us moved mechanically, our movements dictated by the rigorous training. Santini and Silver positioned themselves on either side of the statue, their eyes fixed on its painted face. They were the primary watchers for this session. I grabbed the specialized cleaning tools, a long-handled brush, a scraper, and a spray bottle filled with a specially formulated cleaning agent designed to neutralize the reddish-brown stains. My task was to clean the floor around the statue, to remove the gruesome residue that seemed to accumulate there. I moved slowly, careful to avoid getting too close to the statue. I was acutely aware of the need for 2 sets of eyes on the statue at all times. Santini announced, "Blinking 1," his voice tight. Both Silver and I immediately focused on the statue, our eyes fixed on its grotesque form. Once Santini had blinked and reopened his eyes, confirming his visual on the statue, Silver called out, "Blinking 2." Santini and I kept our unwavering stare on the statue as Silver blinked. The blinking calls continued, a tense, robotic call and response that underscored the constant vigilance required in the presence of the statue. I began my work, scrubbing at the stubborn stains, the rhythmic beeping of the monitoring equipment, a constant reminder of the rules, the ever-present danger, and the importance of maintaining the strict protocol. I kept the statue in my peripheral vision as much as possible, ready to lock eyes with it fully if either Santini or Silver needed to blink out of sync. As I worked, I couldn't help but study the statue. The initial terror had subsided, replaced by a grim fascination. Its surface was rough, textured, covered in tiny imperfections, microscopic variations in the concrete, shifts in the coloration of the spray paint, almost invisible changes in the patterns of the rebar. An idea began to form, a suspicion, a terrifying hypothesis. What if these weren't just random imperfections? What if they were something more? It was during the third cleaning session that I noticed it. The subtle change in the scraping sound, the one that always emanated from the chamber when no one was present. It was always different after we cleaned. The sound was almost imperceptible, like rocks tumbling against each other far away. It was slightly higher in pitch now, and the pattern on the statue, it had shifted, just a fraction. Not a message, no, but a change, nonetheless. The routine had become almost unbearable. The same corridors, the same rhythmic beeping of the monitoring equipment, the same cold dread that coiled in my gut every time we approached SCP-173's containment chamber. But within that monotony, a disturbing fascination had taken root. The subtle variations on the statue's surface, the microscopic shifts in the concrete and paint, they consumed my thoughts. They weren't random. I knew it, felt it with every fiber of my being. There was a pattern, a complex geometric design unfolding before my eyes, hidden beneath layers of grime and the Foundation's meticulous control. I started to stay a little longer each time in the shower, to use the opportunity to memorize the lines and angles of the patterns I saw. My fingers traced the patterns on the walls, trying to burn them into my memory. During my off-duty hours, I meticulously documented my observations in a small worn notebook I'd managed to scrounge from the supply closet. The notebook became my obsession, my lifeline in this oppressive environment. I filled its pages with detailed sketches of the patterns, the shifts, the changes in texture. It wasn't just the visuals. The sound was different after each cleaning too. That scraping, like distant rock grinding on rock, was always present when the chamber was empty, but its frequency, its intensity, it was changing. It was subtle, but I noticed it. The monitoring equipment, however, did not, or so it seemed. I went back to the shower, and this time I focused on the sound, trying to commit it to memory as well. I tried to recreate it by clicking my tongue in different ways. It was close, but not close enough. Months passed. The pattern was becoming clearer, more defined, a series of interlocking geometric shapes that seemed to correspond to the statue's underlying structure, the rebar and concrete beneath the Krylon spray paint. It wasn't a language, not in the traditional sense. It was too precise, too mathematical. It was like a blueprint, a diagram, but of what? What was the Foundation trying to do with it? What was it supposed to mean? The other two, Santini and Silva, they didn't seem to notice, or if they did, they didn't care. They were too focused on survival, on getting through each cleaning session without incident. They followed the procedures, maintained eye contact, and tried to block out the horror of it all. But I couldn't. I needed to understand. I began to see the pattern everywhere, in the cracks on the walls, in the arrangement of the tiles on the floor, even in the way the light flickered in the corridors. It was driving me mad, but I couldn't stop. I dedicated every spare moment to documenting these changes, my scrounged notebook becoming a repository of my increasingly frantic observations. I sketched the patterns, the interlocking shapes, the minute variations that only a trained eye would notice. The pattern was complex, a meticulously crafted design that seemed to mirror the statue's internal structure. It wasn't a language, at least not one I understood. My role was to clean, to scrub away the disturbing reddish-brown stains that mysteriously appeared on the floor around the statue. But with each cleaning session, my focus shifted. I became obsessed with the area near the statue's base, where the pattern was most pronounced. As I cleaned, I began to notice a change in the floor beneath the statue. The concrete felt different, almost smoother, in the areas that corresponded to the most intricate parts of the pattern. It was as if the material was being subtly altered, reshaped at a microscopic level. It was during one of these cleaning sessions, as I was meticulously scrubbing near the base, that I first detected a faint vibration emanating from the floor beneath the statue. It was a series of rhythmic pulses, perfectly synchronized with the scraping sound that echoed through the chamber when it was unoccupied. The vibrations were so subtle that I initially dismissed them as a trick of my imagination, a product of the stress and fear that permeated the place. But they persisted, growing slightly stronger and more defined with each subsequent cleaning session. They felt almost artificial. The realization struck me. The scraping sound wasn't just the statue, it was the sound of the Foundation's technology at work. The vibrations, the subtle changes in the concrete, the evolving pattern on the statue's surface, they were all interconnected. The Foundation wasn't just passively observing SCP-173, they were actively manipulating it, using some form of advanced technology to alter its structure at a microscopic level. The pattern wasn't just a visual anomaly, it was a guide, a control mechanism for their manipulations. They were locking the statue in place, not just with observation, but with a complex system of precisely calibrated vibrations, a hidden geometry that held the anomaly in a state of perpetual stasis. The sound was the key. It had to be. This revelation was both terrifying and exhilarating. It meant that the Foundation's control over SCP-173 was far more intricate, far more profound than I had ever imagined. They were not merely containing a dangerous anomaly, they were manipulating the fabric of reality to keep it in check. But it also meant that their control was not absolute. The shifts in the pattern, the changes in the scraping sound, the variations in the vibrations beneath the floor, they were all evidence that the system was not perfect, that it was constantly being adjusted, recalibrated. The statue, in its own way, was resisting. In the following weeks, I became obsessed with documenting these changes. The vibrations under the statue, the evolving pattern, the changing scraping sound, they were all pieces of a puzzle I was determined to solve. I accidentally dropped my cleaning brush on several occasions, creating a sharp, jarring noise. Each time Santini and Silver would tense, their bodies rigid, their faces even paler than usual. I could hear the sharp intake of their breath, but their eyes remained locked on the statue, unwavering in their focus. The monitoring equipment's beeping would spike, indicating a brief disruption, but nothing else seemed to happen. The pattern, however, did shift after each incident. It was as if the system was compensating for the interference, adjusting its parameters to maintain its grip on the statue. My actions had confirmed my theory. The Foundation was actively manipulating the statue. The Foundation's control was not as absolute as they believed. There were flaws, tiny imperfections in their meticulously crafted system. And I was determined to find them, to understand them, to perhaps one day even exploit them. The risks were immense, I knew, but the truth, however terrifying, was the only thing that mattered now. One day, while browsing through the restricted files on a terminal I'd managed to gain access to during a brief stint in the facility's data center, a perk of my D-class status, believe it or not, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. It was a heavily redacted report on my predecessor, a D-class designated D-173-1, a former sculptor named Jasper Bell. The report detailed his assignment to SCP-173, his meticulous observations, and his growing understanding of the pattern. Bell's sketches were attached to the report, and they were almost identical to my own. He had seen the same things, heard the same sounds, and reached the same conclusions, although he never figured out the connection between the sound and the vibrations. But he had been terminated before he could reveal his findings. His research had been confiscated. The report stated that he had become unstable, a danger to the containment protocol. The truth was far more chilling. He had known too much. The Foundation wasn't just containing SCP-173, they were using it, experimenting on it, and they were willing to kill to protect their secrets. I was living on borrowed time. I had to make a choice, and I had to make it soon. My next cleaning session was scheduled for tomorrow. It could be my last chance to expose the truth, or my last chance to survive. The pattern was almost complete now, the geometric design nearly fully formed. I could almost feel the statue straining against its invisible bonds, the Foundation's technology struggling to maintain control. Tomorrow, everything would change, one way or another. As we walked towards the containment chamber, the rhythmic beeping of the monitoring equipment seemed louder than usual. Or maybe it was just my paranoia, amplified by the lack of sleep and the constant dread. Santini and Silva were unusually quiet. They knew something was different. They could sense the change in the air, the heightened tension that clung to me. Had they noticed the changes in the statue? Did they suspect anything? The heavy steel door of the containment chamber stood before us, a gateway to the unknown. The two guards swiped their cards, and the door opened, revealing the chamber within. And there it stood, SCP-173, its grotesque form frozen in its unnatural pose, the reddish-brown stains on the floor around it. We took our positions, the routine movements almost automatic now. Santini and Silva positioned themselves on either side of the statue, their eyes fixed on its painted face. The blinking calls began, a monotonous litany that had become the soundtrack to our shared nightmare. I approached the statue, cleaning brush in hand. I focused on the area near the base, where the pattern was most pronounced, where the subtle vibrations from the floor were the strongest. This was it. Time to put my plan into action. As I scrubbed, I accidentally let the brush slip from my grasp. It clattered to the floor, the clang echoing through the chamber, a jarring disruption of the carefully orchestrated routine. It was precisely timed to coincide with what I believed to be a critical phase in the vibration cycle. Santini and Silva flinched, their eyes widening in alarm, but they held their focus, their training overriding their fear. The beeping of the monitoring equipment spiked, a sharp, insistent pulse that reflected the sudden disruption. I held my breath, my eyes fixed on the statue, waiting, praying that my calculations were correct. Had I done it? Had I disrupted the containment field? Then it began. It wasn't a physical change, not at first. It was a shift in perception, a distortion of reality. The walls of the containment chamber rippled like the surface of a disturbed pool of water. The beeping of the monitoring equipment became erratic, an unsettling jumble of discordant sounds. "What the?" Santini muttered, his voice laced with a terror I had never heard before. His eyes were wide, unblinking, fixed on the statue. Silva made a choked, rasping sound, like air being forced through a constricted throat. "I see it. I see it too," he whispered, his focus fixed on the statue. His pupils were dilated, black pits swallowing the whites of his eyes. The walls were covered in the reddish-brown substance, splattered and smeared, as if a massacre had taken place. The corridors were filled with twisted, contorted statues, replicas of SCP-173, their concrete forms frozen in poses of violence and agony. And among them other figures, other SCPs, freed from their containment, a kaleidoscope of unimaginable horrors. And there, in the midst of it all, were our bodies, broken, discarded, our lifeless eyes staring up at the ceiling. In this horrific vision, the statue was no longer bound by the rules of observation. It moved, but not in any way that resembled living motion. Instead of walking, it translocated in short, instantaneous bursts, appearing in one spot and then another without traversing the space between. Each repositioning was accompanied by a crunch of concrete against concrete, as if its joints were grinding together. The reddish-brown stains on its body flowed and swirled like thick liquid, spreading across its surface before receding, leaving trails. Its painted eyes, once flat and lifeless, now held a terrifying depth, as if they were actual ocular organs. They swiveled independently of each other, darting around the room and taking in everything at once. The painted-on smile widened and narrowed slightly, independent of any musculature. One moment the statue was on the other side of the room, a silent figure amidst the chaos. The next it was directly before my own lifeless body. The painted eyes, deep set and pitch black, now swiveled down, fixing on my vacant stare. It extended a hand, not to attack as we had come to expect, but to outline my form with its touch, leaving behind a multicolored residue on my skin, like a chemical film. Then with the same crunch and shift, it appeared beside Santini, repeating the same meticulous tracing of his corpse. One of the painted eyes remained fixed on Santini's form, while the other rotated independently towards me, a disconcerting effect that made it seem as if two separate entities were observing us simultaneously. The painted-on smile spread wider, revealing not teeth, but a smooth, concave surface that absorbed the surrounding light, a miniature void. It was a shared hallucination, a collective delusion, but it felt so real, so visceral. The terror was suffocating, a presence that filled the chamber, choking us, drowning us in its horrific imagery. We were trapped in a nightmare of our own making, a vision of the Foundation's ultimate failure. The vision held us captive, frozen in place, unable to move, to speak, to break free from the horrifying spectacle. Was this a consequence of my tampering with the containment field? A side effect of disrupting the delicate balance of forces that held SCP-173 in check? Or was it something inherent to the entity itself, a glimpse into its true nature? A psychic assault, unleashed when its physical form was constrained. Perhaps it was a window into a potential future, a chaotic reality that would unfold if the Foundation's control were to permanently falter. Or, a more disturbing thought, was this the actual reality, and our perceived reality merely a construct maintained by the Foundation's technology, a thin veil over a horrifying truth? Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The horrifying vision of the breached facility dissolved, replaced by the sterile walls of the containment chamber. The beeping of the monitoring equipment returned to its normal, steady rhythm. My eyes darted around frantically, taking in the scene. Santini and Silva were on the floor, sprawled in unnatural positions, their bodies twitching, their eyes vacant and unfocused. I stared at them, a sickening realization creeping over me. They weren't looking at the statue, and neither was I. A primal fear, colder and sharper than anything I had ever felt, seized me. I was alone, the only one potentially maintaining eye contact, and I had broken it. Before I could react, before I could even turn towards SCP-173, a sound from behind me froze me in place. The rhythmic, chillingly familiar cadence of blinking calls. Blinking 1. Blinking 2! The voices were slightly muffled, but the protocol was unmistakable. Slowly I turned. Behind me stood 5 additional guards. 2 were positioned in the standard observation stance, their eyes locked onto SCP-173, their posture rigid and unwavering. The other 3, weapons holstered, were already moving towards Santini and Silva. As they reached the incapacitated men, one of the 3 called out, "Blinking 3!" One of the guards maintaining eye contact with the statue blinked, then resumed his steadfast gaze. It was clear. This was a practiced drill, a contingency for when D-Class personnel were compromised. The 3 guards efficiently hoisted Santini and Silva's limp bodies, their movements coordinated and precise. Another guard called out Blinking 4, followed by Blinking 5 as they rotated their duties. This rotation was part of their training to deal with a situation like this one, where the D-Class broke down. There would always be a minimum of 2 guards watching the statue. I stood frozen, watching them. The pattern on the statue's surface seemed to vibrate, as if the entity within was aware of the events that had just transpired, aware of the complex web of control that held it captive. I had made my choice, and now I had to live with the consequences. They took me away, not to my cell, but to a brightly lit room I hadn't seen before. Inside, a severe-looking man in a white coat, Dr. Albright, a name I recognized from the orientation materials, awaited. He didn't speak, merely gestured for me to sit on a metal stool. I did as I was told. There was no due process, no explanation. D-173-3, Dr. Albright began. Your actions during the last cleaning session were unorthodox. You deviated from protocol, and while you did maintain composure during the incident, the fact remains you instigated it. As a result of your actions, 2 D-class personnel suffered severe psychological trauma and are currently unresponsive in a comatose state. Observation of SCP-173 was nearly compromised. As for you, his eyes fixed on me, cold and assessing. You are no longer fit for duty involving Euclid-class anomalies, not after demonstrating such initiative. Reassignment protocols will be initiated. You will be demoted to assisting with safe-class object maintenance. Consider yourself fortunate. This is not a punishment, but a precaution. We can't have personnel, even D-class personnel, disrupting containment, even if their intentions, as your records suggest, were inquisitive. He paused, his attention held for a moment too long. Perhaps your talents will be better suited elsewhere, where your penchant for detail won't endanger yourself or others. I was dismissed without another word. Guards escorted me not back to the familiar D-class block, but to a different section of the facility, a lower level. My new assignment was the maintenance of safe-class objects, harmless anomalies that required minimal containment. I was to clean, to catalogue, to observe, but never to interact, never to experiment. My new reality was a monotonous routine of cleaning storage containers, polishing inert objects, and documenting their unchanging properties. My talents, as Dr. Albright so dryly put it, were now wasted on mundane tasks, my curiosity stifled, my spirit broken. But the seed of doubt had been planted in my mind and perhaps in the minds of others. And in this place where secrets were currency and control was paramount, doubt was a dangerous thing, a very dangerous thing indeed. The Foundation's secrets were safe. But for how long? My new routine was monotonous, but I kept seeing things, noticing things, details that others missed. It was only a matter of time before I did something unorthodox again.